the American presence is what has made the Persian Gulf region so calm for the last 70 years. And I gotta underline that. Despite all the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia and Syria, this is the calmest period in this region's history. And the only reason it's been relatively calm is the Americans had to have the oil flowing to power the global order. Now that the Americans don't care, now that the Americans are leaving, this region goes back to the old rivalries. And these two powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are going to be at each other's throats very soon. You could actually argue that the civil war in Syria is kind of the opening gambit in this conflict. The Saudis and the Iranians have backed opposite sides. The Iranians get a lot of flack in the United States for being hyper-violent. They are, but they're not nearly as violent as what the Saudis have done. Because at the end of the day, the Iranians actually want to rule this region, and so they've worked with the standing government of Bashar Assad. The Saudis don't. They know that no one in the region respects them. They know that they lack the institutional capacity to actually rule this region. So they're willing to burn it down, burn it all down if that hurts Iran. So when you look at all these conflicts that are simmering in the region, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, this is what they are in a moment of calm. When the Saudis still have some hope that the Americans are going to remain engaged and impose some sort of stability on the region from the outside. As soon as the Saudis give up on that hope, the gloves come off and this gets serious. One of the things about the global order, one of the defining characteristics, is the Americans basically told the whole world that geography doesn't matter anymore. We're going to patrol the oceans for everyone, so you don't need a navy. We're going to guarantee raw material and market access for everyone, so you don't have to do that for yourself. And this enabled countries the world over to access raw materials and energy on one side and finished goods and consumer markets on the other side, and expand and develop and urbanize and modernize in ways they never could have before. Now, for the countries that could do that already, this was kind of a gut punch. Because these were the countries that were special before, and all of a sudden the Americans say, no, you're not special anymore. Now, the short list of countries that could function without the Americans, Japan, far and away the top of the list. Turkey makes the top 4. France does really well. So does Argentina. These are all countries that enjoy a degree of strategic insulation, a meaningful military structure relative to their challenges, and the ability to produce the goods or reach in a relatively easy fashion the resources and the markets that they need. These are the countries that are going to be rising up. Now, they're not all doing it at the same pace. And in the Middle East specifically, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, the broad-scale withdrawal from the entire region, that leaves it to the local powers, whether out of opportunity or desperation, they're forced to take matters into their own hands. In the case of the Turks just assumed that because the Americans under the order had always taken steps to preserve stability and in general get along with Ankara on anything that they wanted to do, they just assumed that the Americans were going to be moving in large scale and deposing the Assad regime. And when the Obama administration declined to do that, it was a shock. And when the Trump administration then says, we're going to pull out, but you don't do anything cheeky, it was almost a challenge. Because now Turkey is in this zone where the Iranians and the Russians are actively intervening and the Americans are doing nothing. And it's starting to sink in Turkey that if anyone is going to do anything to look out for Turkish national interests in their near abroad, it absolutely has to be Turkey, because no one else is going to do it. And one of the things that we have forgotten in this world is that Turkey is not an Arab country. Turkey is not a European country. Turkey is Turkish. It is an independent pole in international affairs. It hasn't been since World War II. It has been subsumed into the American alliance network. But now that the American alliance network is no more, the Turks are realizing, a little belatedly, that their neighborhood to do with as they choose. Doesn't mean it's risk-free, doesn't mean that they won't have pushback. But if there is going to be a settlement in Syria that they like, they are going to have to be the ones who settle it and then be responsible for it. And what is going on in northern Syria right now is exactly that. The Turks are waking up, rediscovering the tools of power that are necessary to counter countries like Iran and Russia, who have been agitated against the international order for so much longer. The Turks realize now that this is entirely up to them. All of this is over the decade that we're living in now. The two powers that you have to pay attention to, of course, are Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, Iran, as we mentioned, has been raging against the American-led order ever since the Ayatollah came to power in 1979-1980. And they see the order and America's position in maintaining a static stability in the region as their primary concern. Iran, Persia as we used to call it, would expand out every few generations and conquer most of the area. But the Iran of today is not the same as the Persia of old. The Persia of old was a polyglot, multi-ethnic empire in which everyone was basically encouraged to define themselves as Persian. It was, if you will, the United States of the day. It included everyone from everywhere. Every valley had its own identity, and they all worked together towards a Persian goal. Now, we're still talking about the Middle Ages and before. It's not that people weren't beaten or anything like that, and it's not like this was a democracy, but it was relatively egalitarian. What happened in the Age of Empires, however, is that the Europeans came in with their deep water navigation and basically cut Iran out of the entire world. They had been the nexus for what passed as global trade. But as soon as the Portuguese and the Spanish figured out how to bypass this entire region and go interface with the Spice Islands and the Chinese directly, all of a sudden Iran became a nowhere. And all of the wealth that used to flow into it went away. The egalitarianism went away, the wealth went away, the cosmopolitanism went away, and the Iran of today is an empty shell compared to what it was. Now, into this environment, about a century ago, the Iranians discovered oil. And they went from having one of the most sophisticated, varied economies in the world to all of a sudden being a rentier state, where there was just one commodity that brought in money and, honestly, invading armies. And Iran ceased being significant. Iran of the Ayatollahs wants the glory days back. But they don't understand that they need to start from scratch and rebuild the cosmopolitan that used to undergird the old Persian Empire, and that is a century, a 2-century, a 3-century process. So they're stuck with the economy of today and the political system of yesteryear, and that is just not a good combination. You know, people who are chomping at the bit to get back to the glory days, but they really lack the tools. And so what they do is they just work to undermine the systems of everybody else, cause chaos in order to tear down opposing systems so theirs can rise. On the other side, you've got the Saudis, which are, the Saudis are probably some of the least egalitarian people in the world. We've got there a single family, the Al Sauds, who think of themselves as medieval despots of old, divine right of kings, that sort of thing, and how everyone in their country basically exists to serve their needs. They look at the Persians with concern because in times the Persians have conquered what is today Saudi Arabia. But really, it's a lot more visceral than that. The Saudis and their allies, the Wahhabis, used to be desert raiding tribes. They never had much going on. They basically existed by kidnapping and drug smuggling. And then they rose to control this territory that we know as Saudi Arabia, and shortly thereafter they discovered oil. And so you take this mindset that is kind of the worst of all worlds and all of a sudden make it fabulously wealthy. So there's not a lot of work ethic, there's no technical skills, they bring in foreigners to do everything, but they're mad rich. I would argue that the Iranians are doing everything that they can, that they're, if anything, overexposed right now. So their ability to surge violence into this region, I don't think it exists. That doesn't mean that they're done by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they've pushed as hard as they possibly can. They might be able to maintain this tempo, but I don't think they can increase it. The Saudis absolutely can. The Saudis conservatively have $2 trillion saved up in their sovereign wealth funds, not all of which is on the books. They also, every once in a while, prune minor branches of the family tree and throw princes in prison and take all their cash. So their ability to ramp up what they're doing is extreme. Keep in mind that some of the backroom, quiet militant groups that the Saudis have spawned and unleashed upon their enemies in the past include groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So their capacity for, just with a few weeks' notice, to go up and stir up a lot of trouble, throw a lot of cash at a militant group, provide them with a little bit of intelligence and weapons, that's almost bottomless. And the only reason it hasn't been more is because they think that the Americans might not be ready to leave. Now, as soon as the Americans do formally leave, they're going to try to find a new sponsor, but really there aren't a lot of players. The Europeans and the Asians really don't have the staying power to play a role, and certainly don't have the deployable militaries in terms of, getting a large army to the region to make a difference. Turkey's a possibility, but honestly, the Turks think as badly of the Saudis, I think, as I do. The best bet is probably Israel. Israel is of the firm belief that if we can get various members of the Islamic world fighting each other, then they're not going to have the spare bandwidth to go after the Jewish state. And that's probably a really good plan. So they're providing already the Saudis with weapons training, with some equipment that the Americans won't give them, with time on target intelligence. They're stirring up groups around the region in parallel with the